Hi, everyone. Welcome to Changing Minds, the series that explores the psychology and neuroscience of human behavior. I'm your host, Joe Devlin. We all love a good what if question. What if we hadn't closed schools? What if we reopened small businesses? What if I moved in with my parents? Would they be safer now? But why do we ask questions without an answer? What are they good for? And why are so many convinced that they know the truth? Today, I'm joined by Professor Dave Lagnado, Professor of Cognition and Decision Sciences at UCL. Welcome to Changing Minds, Dave.
Good evening. Good afternoon.
Can hear you loud and clear. So before we get started, I'd just like to remind our audience that if they have any questions for Dave, please do share them in the Q&A board as we go along or as we take questions from the audience. But the sooner you get them in, the more likely we are to see them. So then just to get things going, Dave, why do we engage in what seems like such a trivial pastime? It seems fine for when you're down the pub with your mates and you're going to argue about what may or may not have ever been true, but is it more than that?
Well, unfortunately, we don't get much chance to be down the pub with our mates at the moment, but on Zoom, we might argue. Yeah, so I would like to say that it's really far from trivial. What if reasoning is really central to how we think, and it's based on our need to try and understand the cause and effect in the world to allow us to predict, control, and explain the world around us. And this, of course, is heightened in times of crisis and uncertainty. How does the virus spread? How can it be treated? Should I self-isolate? Should I wear a mask? I'm just taking a really simple example. A few weeks ago, I had a bad fever, a headache, sore throat, and I was starting to worry that I might have coronavirus. Then I thought, well, hang on a second, maybe it's hay fever. And obviously the symptoms overlap quite a lot. So I kind of asked myself a what if question. What if I take some hay fever pills, which I don't normally take? And well, if the symptoms go away, then that's good news. Fortunately, I took the hay fever pills and the symptoms did go away. So I'm not definitely out of the woods, but that was pretty good. So that's just a really simple example of what if reasoning using, trying to infer causality. And that kind of pattern is just like crucial for how we learn from our error, how we plan, and how we make decisions.
Right at the moment, the government's faced with a lot of questions about policies that they could adopt, right? About reopening schools or small businesses. I suppose these kind of what if questions are sort of central to trying to plan the best path forward.
Yeah, no, exactly. And these are really difficult problems, especially when we don't have a lot of data and we don't exactly know what's going on. As I said, we don't really understand the underlying causal structure. And experts use mathematical models to explore these what if scenarios, and often that informs government policy. But just, as we're aware, there's high uncertainty about how the virus spreads, how it works its way through, populations, and also uncertainty about how people will behave in such novel situations, whether we will obey lockdown, all those kinds of things. So there's loads of assumptions that go into this modeling, and different models use different assumptions. So it's an incredibly difficult problem. And just, we as lay people also have to try and follow this and make up our own minds and run our own models. And one thing that makes these what if questions particularly difficult is if we don't know the underlying causal mechanisms. And then there are real dangers of misinterpreting the data we're getting. And this is a really nice example I just read in the New Scientist a few days ago, and it just seems so topical. And it's actually back from the 90s. It's a non-COVID example, obviously. And it's analysis of hospital data that showed that patients with pneumonia were more likely to survive if they also had asthma. Okay, so that's very counterintuitive. Does asthma somehow improve your chances of surviving pneumonia? But once you dig a bit deeper into the data and to try and understand what's generating it, they discovered that patients with asthma were being sent straight to the intensive care unit and therefore received more aggressive treatment and therefore were more likely to survive. So this is just one example of how we've got to dig beneath the numbers and the data and try and understand the causal mechanisms that generates that data. Otherwise, we are in danger of, making flawed conclusions.
I can see how understanding these causal mechanisms would be really important for planning and trying to decide things in the future. But a lot of the questions that we ask are kind of looking backwards, right? Like what if the government had reacted more quickly in sourcing medical supplies or implementing lockdown? What's the role of this kind of what if question when it's already passed?
Okay, that's, yeah, so a really, I mean, amazing feature of the mind in a way is that we can kind of go back, we can think things have already happened, and then we can kind of go back and think, what if we'd done something differently? And these are called counterfactuals, and it's a very special kind of what if reason. And I mean, we're very good at it, and it's also something very hard to get a computer to do. But it's something that we're very good at, but it can be dangerous. So, for example, a counterfactual on the tip of everyone's lips at the moment is, what if the UK had locked down earlier? And so what we have to do is you have to kind of, if you like, rewind the world back to the point at which, before lockdown was decided a couple of weeks before that, and think about implementing lockdown at that point, and then how things would have progressed after that. And so we kind of use the same causal machinery as general what if questions, but it's harder to confirm or refute these questions because it's a counterfactual world, so we don't actually know what would have happened. We have to kind of like guess and use other assumptions to try and work out what would have happened. And one way of doing this, and I've noticed that actually quite a few people are doing this now, is to look at what's happening in other countries or using our models, updated models, to try and figure it out and to figure out what would have happened. And obviously, in the case of the UK, I think we can probably agree that if we had lockdown earlier, we'd have avoided quite a lot of deaths. Okay, but ultimately, to really answer these questions, we need a good causal model of how things work. And so now I'm going to move on to another example, which is where counterfactuals seem key to how we establish the effectiveness of public health interventions. So I'm actually going to steal the screen from you, Joe, if that's okay.
Do it.
I hope it works. Okay. So can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can. Can you tell us what we're looking at?
Yeah, I'll tell you. So this is actually a tweet from a professor of public health who's been very vocal about things, and I think has taught a lot of great sense. So I'll just read out the tweet. The problem of public health focused on prevention is that if we react and prevent something catastrophic from happening, and then because of that reaction, things don't play out badly, we are told we were spreading panic. Public health works when it is invisible. So I think it's a really nice quote. And there's also a really good figure that's been going around Twitter. And I'll just talk you through this because I think it's a really nice illustration of this point. So we have, on the y-axis, we have the new cases, and on the x-axis, we have time. And then business as usual, if we don't implement strict measures, is represented by this brown curve going up and up. Whereas if we actually enforce prevention and precaution efforts, is represented by the green curve. And as flattening the curve, it's trips off the tongue. Everyone's talking about that. So the point here is that once the flattening of the curve starts working, the danger is that people will say, "Oh, it wasn't so bad after all. We overreacted." That's, if you like, the danger. And you can extrapolate this and think that once the curve starts really going down, people might think, "Oh, great, we did it. Let's stop this and return to normal." And then there's the danger that then you have a second peak, and that is a real danger that people are currently worried about. Okay, so this is like the public health view. And I find it quite useful to use a causal model to represent this. So I'm not going to explain all the nitty gritty, but you represent events or variables with nodes. And so here, this is a node representing the severity of a crisis, which we didn't know about initially. And then this is the cause of people's forecasts, which will then, potentially cause actions. And then it's the action plus the crisis playing out, which will determine the kind of outcomes we see. This is very simplified just for illustrative purposes. So the public health view is that, well, things are going to be really bad. It's a severe crisis. Things are going to be really bad if we don't act. And this is, if you can see, this is the brown line, really. Okay, so you act. And then what we see is that deaths are reduced. The actions really helped. Okay, and so this kind of supports the counterfactual. Things would have been much worse without the action. So this is like the public health view, and I think it's the right story. But there are also counter views, and I've actually seen quite a lot of these arguments put forward. A lot coming from the US. I'm not sure why that is, and here's again, this is a tweet from Dinesh D'Souza. I cannot even begin to describe the public backlash that will occur if coronavirus kills fewer Americans this year than the flu. So this is really implying a certain slightly different reading. And here I would say that if you see the arrow from action to outcome is now being kind of ignored. And the argument goes, well, yeah, deaths are reduced. But that's because the crisis was less severe than people predicted. They were actually making poor forecasts. So this counter-narrative, I think, is actually a bit dangerous. And the consequence is that the counterfactual reaction wouldn't have made a difference if we hadn't done it. So I think that there's actually pretty good evidence against this view, but it's really important that no one buys into it, because that could potentially change their actions. And so we kind of want to ensure that people understand that their actions are making a difference for the good, and not to think that, oh, well, people just got the forecast wrong and they were panicking. And what's interesting here is it's actually quite tricky, because preventative actions are quite tricky for people to understand, especially when it's a collective action. So it's not just my action that makes a difference, it's me plus a collective action. So that is a harder thing I think, to perceive. And also there are time lags, which also make causality harder to perceive.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems to me that trying to draw these kind of conclusions then depends an awful lot on the specifics of your model of what causal mechanisms are. If you have a different model, you come to a different interpretation of the same results. It seems to me that's the kind of thing that commissions and inquiries and things are setting out to do all the time, right? I mean, when you look back at an event and say, should we have handled this better? What are the lessons we should learn for the future? You're effectively trying out some models to see whether or not actions that weren't taken but might have been could have changed things. Is that what they're doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, people don't actually build these models yet, although I think it would be a good idea to try and build these models. But yeah, but looking backwards and trying to, in a way, assign blame. I mean, it's the blame game, really. And counterfactuals are a crucial part of that. Not the only part of it, but they are a crucial part. And I mean, what's interesting here is you do often have a complex network of causes. So, for example, in the current crisis, the bats were involved, there were wet markets, there were potentially initial cover-ups by the Chinese government, there were slow reactions by certain governments, there was lack of preparation by certain governments. And so actually there's a whole array of causes which are all combining in complex ways, actually. And so one thing about that is you have to be really careful to kind of pick out the causal structure, but also it gives you room to potentially pick your causes according to your own goals and maybe even your own ideology. And so I'll just mention two kind of dangers here. One is the danger of kind of just trying to pick out one cause, which might be more like a proximal cause, like a trigger. So you might focus on the wet markets and say, oh, we've got to ban them at wet markets. But this, in a way, is ignoring the more systemic causes, like what's the system that led to a market, which then led to that kind of trigger. Okay, so I think that's really important to really look at the causal structures that lead to maybe the more specific proximal causes. And another thing, I think, and this is probably quite obvious, but it's not easy to get right, is we need to, when we're blaming someone, we need to think about what they knew at the time or what they should have known. We shouldn't use hindsight and just assume that they should have known things that, were unpredictable. Okay, so it's a very delicate balance between, what did they know at the time or what should they have known? And I think that this is going to play out in a very interesting way soon when we look at how the UK government made their decisions. Okay, no, I mean, it's too early to cast the blame, but, and I mean, the key point here is that we're very ready to assign blame, but it's actually an incredibly complex process.
And, I mean, it feels like we're all kind of armchair experts with this. We can sit down the pub when the pub's open or, argue over Zoom or blogs and whatnot. But is there sort of a more rigorous way? I mean, you've alluded to models and even, crunching the math for this. Are there ways of quantifying sort of, well, this is more or less likely? So for instance, you see stuff about 5G being assigned to this virus. And I'd say, the scientific evidence makes that very unlikely. I mean, really, really unlikely. But you don't want to necessarily just throw it out, right? I mean, are there ways of putting all of these things into your causal model and then using some kind of formal tools to evaluate what's reasonable?
Yeah, no, so I showed you a very toy model really, but you can build much more systematic and complex models. And I think, and you can also use quantitative data to make these more rigorous. But I think the key thing in a way is getting the graph structure right and thinking about what variables really matter and how they connect up with other variables. And I think at the moment, a lot of that comes down to human judgment as much as it does come down to AI. But I think what AI is good for is, given that you, if you like, draw up a model, you can then do pretty complex inference over the model, things that you couldn't do just with pen and paper. And so you can actually discover implications of your model that you might not have thought of and might not be aware of. And so even though this is kind of like ongoing work, people are using this kind of causal modeling for modeling fault diagnosis in large computer systems. There's also some usage now in legal cases. And I feel it's a very natural path to try and understand these things better. And just one thing to add is that I feel it's the process of the modeling that's almost the key thing. It's not so much the numbers it chucks out, but it's like the process of the modeling allows you to think about what variables are important, to think hard about the causality, to fill in gaps for things that you might not be thinking about, to uncover your assumptions and potentially debate them. And then the modeling, the more technical tool, allows you to do computation over those models and things that you wouldn't be able to do, as I said, just by hand. And so it's kind of a combination of the two things. I think it's a combination of human reasoning and our knowledge about cause and effect, plus the kind of systematic power and data mining abilities of computational methods. So acting together, I think we can get a better grip on trying to analyze these kind of problems.
I hadn't really thought about it that way. I mean, back in the day, I actually did my PhD in AI and got a little bit frustrated between the artificial side and the sort of actual intelligence. But it sounds like this is a really nice example where the humans bring one set of skills to the table, like some of the creativity and trying to understand maybe the nodes and the graph structure, whereas the computers allow us to sort of systematically investigate that in a way that actually we would struggle to as people. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think what's interesting now is that we are, as human reasoners, we are pretty good at like common sense cause and effect reasoning. And this is the kind of thing that is now being developed more in AI, like Judicial, Pearl and others of developing it. And they're kind of basing a lot of their intuitions on human reasoning and human intuition. And they're getting the kind of, if you like, the AI to kind of mimic in some way sound human reasoning. So I think it's quite interesting here now that AI is kind of learning from humans in order to do what they do better. And even like counterfactual reasoning is still a great challenge to AI. And it's something that, as we've discussed, it's something that we do pretty readily.
Yeah, that's remarkable. It's a neat perspective, just one that I hadn't really considered before. Thanks. So Dave, I mean, you sort of forgive me for saying this, but it does feel like what if thinking's a bit sort of like the Clint Eastwood spaghetti Western. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, is that a fair kind of assessment?
Well, one of my favorite movies. Well, it used to be when I was a teenager. Yeah, so just to, kind of, it's a nice way to recap. Like the good is, I actually think it's an amazing quality that we have to kind of do this kind of what if reasoning and understand causal structure and do inference. I mean, for small models, I think it's great. The bad is when we have a wrong model or when we impose a wrong model, and that can be bad and can lead to flawed inferences. And the ugly, I would say, is when we push our agenda, because obviously we can push our agenda through the kinds of models we build. And that, I think that can get ugly, especially when we're starting to blame people.
I think that's a really perfect summary. And I might use that as an opportunity to stop asking questions myself and turn to some of the audience questions, if that's okay with you, Dave.
That's great.
So there's one here from Dan saying, was the what if question easier to manage before social media, back when the only sort of widely broadcast views were those of the experts? Now that the general public's, not trusting experts, and like, for instance, in Brexit, has that made it a more difficult problem?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it is more difficult. I think I would say you've got kind of two layers that you have to negotiate. You've got the kind of causality layer where what's going on, and we're trying to learn that. But then you've got this other layer, which is the media and whether we trust the media, whether we trust experts, and we have to, in a way, assess the reliability and the credibility of the information we're getting. So in a way, we have to negotiate two interlocking structures, not just one. And I would say that the more the kind of, if you like, the media can potentially be flawed in its reasoning and its claims, we actually have a big problem. Not just about figuring out what should be happening and what's working or not, but of figuring out who's credible and what evidence is reliable. And yeah, so I think I think things have got worse. I would say. Well, the problem is bigger. Put it that way. The challenge is bigger.
But in some ways, maybe that emphasizes the joint role of the human and the AI, in the sense that if the model's more complicated because you have all these extra factors, it's really important that you work through the various dynamics, and that's right where people aren't very good at it, right? But that's where the machines can help.
Yeah, no, completely. Yeah, so I think it's a real kind of like division of labor here. Whereas we've got intuitions that we can use, but we also can use the computational stuff to keep us consistent. I mean, one thing we know about human reasoning is we often can engage in probabilistic errors. I mean, probability is hard to reason with, whereas computers are great at reading probabilistically. I mean, they can do Bayes' rule and all that kind of thing with no problem. So I think that we can, tackling it with both human insight and the rigor and consistency of computational methods, I think is a really good combination.
Great, thanks. Let's see, there's another question here from Andrew, which said, what if I've done something? Seems very different than what if someone else had done something. And it might be easier to accept an error or a bad decision if someone else made it, but perhaps kind of beat yourself up if you made it yourself. Are there different cognitive mechanisms going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, again, a great question. I would say that it's not necessarily a different mechanism, but we might well have more access to information about what we do, and we want to change more what we do. And we might have a different stance to someone else's. So I would say that the kind of machinery, the inferential machinery, might be pretty similar, but the information we have and the goals and the desires we have might be different when I'm evaluating my own actions. And I mean, yeah, so kind of what if reasoning, I think when you've done something bad, or, unintentionally, of course, and you kind of think, oh, if only I've done this, we really, I think that's kind of, can actually be too much. We can do too much of that. I don't know how much we do it to someone else in the same way. So I think that, but also we're going to learn more from doing it to ourselves, I think. So in a sense, we've got more opportunity to learn.
It feels like that's one of those things that may differ across individuals too. I mean, some people may be more inclined to be sort of hard on themselves, and others, hard on, or look for external causes. I mean, again, I know I seem to bring this up every week, but I mean, it seems like what's happening from the US government is more around looking for other people's causes and less soul searching about what they themselves could be doing and taking responsibility for.
Yeah, well, the classic finding from social psych is, we take praise for the good things and we blame the world for the bad things. And I think that's by and large true. I think actually you can get at this really nicely looking at people's causal models and looking at how they evaluate counterfactuals and that kind of thing. So I think that kind of insight from social psychology is really good, but I think we can get a lot more in depth looking at it and explore the nuances. If you use a kind of causal modeling framework, I think it can really help.
So there's a question here from Mattia saying, basically following up on this, saying, how do we place blame on government if policies had good intention and they were executed, but they had sort of unexpected consequences?
Yeah. So I mean, I kind of simply said that, well, we have to be really careful about blaming people, decision makers, for stuff that they didn't know about. Now, really, it's not just what they didn't know, it's what they should have known is the key thing, really. It's like, what reasonably should they have known? So it could be that actually, even though they didn't know stuff, they really should have, and they really should have got more evidence before doing things. And so that kind of, answers, in a way, addresses the issue to do with unexpected spillovers. I mean, if they were really massively unexpected and they really couldn't have predicted them, then I think it would be harsh to blame them. But I think that many times there are spillovers which are kind of like reasonably expected. And I think those things we should be held accountable for.
So that's the hindsight issue, isn't it? I mean, the obvious example at the moment is, there've been the number of people who've gone to poison centers and hospitals for ingesting bleach has gone up. And
oh, wow.
Well, you
Okay.
would potentially argue that that's the kind of thing that you should have known before taking that particular action, just because the information was available.
I think actually that's a really good point. It's quite hard to know what certain presidents should have known. Getting a model of some people is pretty impossible, actually. I mean, it's quite staggering to try and reverse engineer the mind of some people. Put it that way.
So there's a question here that says, how can understanding counterfactuals help inform the inevitable inquiry that's going to happen post-COVID?
Yeah, so I think that it's going to be crucial to really look at the counterfactuals that, like what if UK had locked down earlier? And those questions are going to be actually slightly tricky. I mean, I think the modelling and what's going on in other countries suggests that the answer to that is pretty clear. But I think there's going to be a lot of other questions which are more difficult. What I think is going to be really difficult is looking at the decision-making process of the government, for example, and getting access to what really went on there. Because I think that's crucial. As I said, it's crucial how those decisions were made. And counterfactual is really important there as well, because would they have made different decisions had they had different information? I mean, it could be that even though they didn't have information, if they had it, they still would have acted the same. So I think counterfactuals are really important when we look at the decision processes that actually went on. And yeah, so I think it's going to be incredibly important. I mean, maybe it's a bit early to do it now, but I'm very pleased that certain journalists are digging deep into this, because if we leave it too long, we'll lose some of the information. I mean, information decays over time, and so it's good to get that information now and have inquiries later.
And again, that makes just a ton of sense. Let me just switch to a sort of more judicial line of things with a question from Louis saying, what's the relationship between this kind of model and judicial processes for establishing cause or guilt?
Okay, great. So I like that question because I've spent a lot of my time modeling legal cases. And I mean, to be honest, the legal profession and the legal system are very averse to using probabilistic models or causal models. So it has been a bit of a struggle to try and get those into the legal system. But I have been involved in cases, and quite a few colleagues, where we have tried to be more systematic in the modeling of legal cases, if that's what Louis is talking about. And so I think that in the future, we should, those kind of things should be brought in, definitely when it comes to an inquest, but even pre-trial, when you're trying to sort out the evidence and to work out the best way of presenting evidence and the best way of the jury understanding evidence, I think modelling can only help us. And just to reiterate what I said before, sometimes it's the process of modelling that really helps you. It's not necessarily you do the model to get the answer. It's more you do the model to really understand the problem and then see what things you're missing to understand and evaluate the arguments. So I think that the process of modelling is almost as important as the product of modelling.
And Dave, I think we have time for maybe just one more quick question. And I love this one just because it either came from an AI or a guy named Al. I can't quite tell.
Okay.
But he said, when this is all done, will we be taking governments to court for lots of unnecessary debts?
Okay, well, that's... I think it could be pretty interesting. I mean, I don't know whether I have a right answer for that one, but I think that we should be holding them to account for sure. And I think we should really look at the decision-making process. And just kind of reflecting on something I mentioned earlier, it's, okay, there might have been a few people who said stupid things and did, odd things, but it's also the process and the system that we need to worry about. Was the system working well? Not just what did it cause now, but what was the system in good order in order for us to deal with this kind of crisis? So I think looking at the system is as important as looking at individuals in that system. But I think that, yes, we should have a really severe inquiry.
I think that that's really kind of a perfect place to end today. I mean, we've run out of time with still lots of good questions on there. And in fact, some of them that we didn't quite get around to were about how you could maybe apply these concepts outside of a public health, public policy into a more sort of a business framework. I assume, Dave, they'd still be very relevant, right? You could use this?
Oh, completely. I think business, law, medicine as well. I mean, all these techniques are entering slowly into things like medicine and law. And business, maybe a bit. I mean, I've been involved with some work with BlackRock where we've been using causal modelling. So these things are entering into a much broader realm. And I think that it's a really good time now to think hard about how we can use them.
It just sounds like a really innovative, exciting approach. And you know what, I think given that we've run out of time, I'll have to have you back another time to talk about that, because I'd love to learn more about it.
I'll come back for the next crisis.
But I would say to anyone who's maybe interested in trying to apply some of these things to their businesses, if you'd like to know more about it, or you have a specific question for Dave, if you could email us at uclchangingminds, all one word, no spaces, uclchangingminds@gmail.com. We'll get your questions to Dave, and we could, try to get you some answers on that.
Yeah.
So Dave, I just want to say, Professor David Lagnado, thank you very much for such a stimulating discussion. Really enjoyed it.
It's been a great pleasure.
Next week, we're going to be talking about the difficulty of home education and what you can do to get it right for both you and for your kids. So please join us next week, and we will see you then. So long, and thanks, everybody.